Hello and welcome to A Doctor's Symphony. You are about to hear and to see, in music, words and images, the story of one family's enforced separation from their homeland and from their loved ones. This is a universal story, sadly repeated throughout history, but it is also a story of the triumph of love and survival over tyranny and evil. And all of this is expressed so vividly in Symphony No.1, Remembrance by Albert Hurwit.
Hello everybody. We are looking at the composer of what you just heard. It is a remarkable story, and I will get down into the details of it as we go on through this whole session. Albert Hurwit is the composer, but you will have noticed from the opening title slides that one of the slides said A Doctor's Symphony Part 2. And that's because last week we looked at another doctor, Alexander Borodin, the Russian composer, who too was a lifelong medical practitioner, and yet he composed symphonies and concertos and chamber music. And with Albert Hurwit, also a doctor, we're going to go into his life in a second, but point out the fact that the greatest hobby, as it were, in his life was music. What you just heard was the very opening of his Symphony No.1, which has the subtitle Remembrance. And I don't think there has ever been a symphony which has quite such a backstory as Albert Hurwit's Symphony No.1 Remembrance has. We're going to get into that story, and you're going to be seeing many pictures of scenes from Russia taken at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th. And we're going to put those photographs together to help narrate the story of Albert's symphony. Let's say a word or two, first of all, about Albert Hurwit, the doctor. Here's a wonderful photograph, as you see, from the New England Central Hospital in Boston, Mass., from 1961, where you see Albert as the chief resident seated dead center of the front row. And here's another picture of him. Radiology was his specialty. And here he is, actually at work as a radiologist. Apart from having an incredibly successful career as a radiologist, Dr. Hurwit, which I'll call him very few times today, because we're going to be talking about the composer, Albert Hurwit. First of all, the slow movement of the symphony that you're about to hear won the American Composers Award in 2009. That's something we need to know, which is an astounding fact about a doctor. He attended a meeting in Russia with the heads of government as an advisor. He was a prime mover in promoting social responsibility and organized many meetings and fundraisers, etc., attracting such luminaries as Robert Redford and Paul Newman on his side to help. An article by him was published in the New York Times, and extraordinarily so, Ralph Nader in his book has the chapter on this specialty written by Albert Hurwit. So you can see how much he affected the world, not just in medicine, but in all that he did, a great humanitarian. But how did it begin that he started to write a symphony? Well, here's a photograph of him at his home, sitting at the piano. Now, he is a very fine pianist, but I have to add that not only does he play by ear, he composes as well. And he has an enormous repertoire of songs, dances, etc., that he has written and sung and had sung. And it was with the advent of computerized technology that he was able finally to notate down in permanent, solid form his compositions. And that's where I come into his life. I was doing my final concert as the music director of the Hartford Symphony Orchestra. And after that concert, Albert, whom I'd already met, came back to see me, and he said, "You know, I think I have a symphony inside of me. Would you help me get it out?" And I said, "Well, can I hear some of your music?" And he invited me to lunch and to play some of his music. And the first piece of music that I heard him play in a recording from his computerized version became the nucleus of this whole symphony, and in some strange way, I absolutely floored him, because as soon as I heard the opening notes, and the same opening notes that you just heard, I said at the end of it, "You know, it sounds Czechoslovakian, Czech, like Czech music." He almost fell over, because he said, "That's exactly where my ancestors came from." And at this point, he introduced me to the fact that his great-great-grandfather came from Prague. And we're here looking at an 18th century print of the city of Prague. And he then explained to me that born in that very city, which was not only a large town at the time, was his great-great-grandfather, Yeshia. Unbelievably, there is a photograph of this man, Yeshia, who begins the whole family story, which we'll get into shortly. Now, I want you to remember these dates. Yeshia was born in Prague in the year 1797, and he died in the year 1906, which means he lived to 109, and it means he lived across 3 centuries. A very rare commodity in this world. But as I say, he is the great-great-grandfather of the composer today, Albert, and we're going to trace that family history and all the travails and the pain that they went through to end up where they are today. And it all begins with Yeshia. Because of the diaspora and the pogroms, it was essential that Jewish people leave Prague. And Yeshia left, and he moved east, a journey of about 750 miles, to a little village in Belarus called Milkovits. And let's have a look at Milkovits on the map. It's very difficult to find these days on a map because it was totally demolished during the Second World War. Many of the photographs today will come from similar-sized villages in Belarus that were not absolutely decimated, but they are, to all intents and purposes for today, very similar to Milkovits itself. And this is where Yeshia settles, in a village very close to Milkovits, so we have to pretend at this moment that it is, and from that same period. Yeshia had a son, Zelig, and we're looking at Zelig, and the family changed their name to the town of Milkovits. There is Zelig, Yeshia's son, with Zelig's wife, Goldie, and Zelig's dates are 1841 to 1925. Now, the first movement of this symphony very quickly turns into a series of dances, because the composer has called this first movement Origins. So we're going into the origins of this family, the kind of places they lived in, the kind of music they listened to, the kind of instrumentalists they heard, and the kind of dances that were done by the village occupants. I'm going to play you some more of that first movement right now, but first just let me tell you how Albert and I worked together. He played me all sorts of fragments of music, songs, lullabies, dances, etc. And yet he wanted to get them into a symphony. And I tried, in my humble way, to stretch him by saying, well, here's a wonderful tune. I want you to give me 6 versions of it. A waltz, a march, a lullaby, a funeral march, and perhaps a skipping tune for children. And to my amazement, he would do all those and more besides. And slowly we built this entire symphony from the initial fragments, and I would set Albert challenges, and every time he came up absolute trumps, and we were able to put like a jigsaw puzzle together in many senses. So let's hear some more of the first movement of Symphony No. 1 by Albert Hurwit. has happened to that idyllic dancing, that idyllic origins of the family and their daily kinds of lives, their holidays and their work days. What has happened to it is this constant purging of ethnic minorities from where they are living. And in Albert Symphony here, you suddenly hear that all is not as it should be. Because, and this is the main reason, here we have on the left Isaac Milkovits, one of Zelig's sons. And we're also looking at Hannah, Isaac's wife. They have been living and enjoying life in Milkovits in Belarus. And suddenly they hear that all is not well, that something is going to happen which will end up separating the family completely. The music that you just listened to, all those wonderful, joyous dances, all the folk music and dances that you hear in this symphony are original folk dances and songs by Albert Hurwit, written clearly in the style of the period that we're looking at today. The same will be true when we come to the next movement. But first of all, this, more than anything else, this whole family story, and it's the story of untold families everywhere, separated. And just imagine what that means when the grandsire has to say to the children in the family and their children, we will never see each other again, but you have to go. And we'll get to that in the second movement. But before that, more than anything else, this is a story of love and of resolve to conquer the kind of evil that you just heard first introduced in the symphony just now. I'm just going to wind ahead to a little later in the first movement. Bear with me. the ending of the first movement of Albert Hurwit's Symphony No.1, subtitled Remembrance. The love and resolve that you hear at the end of that movement, and at the very end, the repetition of yum, pam, pam, do, re, mi. No tune could be simpler, and yet that is the very seed from which this symphony is built. Furthermore, in the movement that you're about to hear, you're going to hear that yum, pam, pa changed very slightly into the minor key, yum, pam, pa, and that is to be absolute key to what is about to happen. Let me just fill you in as to what is going to happen, because I'm going to play this second movement from beginning to end. Let me cue you up in what you're going to be looking at. First of all, the arrival in these beautiful people's lives of the invasion of the Cossacks. And once again, there's going to be a program. Once again, this family is going to split. That will begin the movement. But then suddenly you will hear what I just sang, ya-da-dum, bam, 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 ta-da-dum, bam, bam. And that extraordinarily powerful, almost Beethoven-like phrase, hammered out from the whole orchestra, was literally the composer setting, as it were, to an orchestral song with no voice, "You must go, no, no, no. You must go, no, no," etc. The father telling this lovely man and this woman, "You've got to go. You've got to leave." And indeed, they do. And the gentleman who you're looking at here, dear Isaac, has to say goodbye to his family, not knowing he'll ever see them again, because he is going to follow the footsteps of a relative who had moved to the USA and settled in New Britain, in Connecticut. That was his kind of contact, his early contact. And he, and we're talking here about Isaac, has no option but to leave his wife and 6 children behind, travel to America all by himself, set up a home for the rest of the family, and then send for them when he could afford it. And it took him 4 years to save up enough money to ship across the rest of his family. And it will be very obvious what we are now looking at. And you will see a picture of the Hurwit family, the size of the family that he had to bring across to join him. You'll see that in a moment. And then you will hear their feelings, their deeply stirred feelings. They loved their countryside so much, and the songs and the dancing. And you will hear a wonderful piece of music composed by Hurwit in the style of klezmer music, unmistakable. But in the midst of that reverie and love of their homeland, back come the Cossacks to throw them out. I'll see you at the end of this movement. That movement is called Separation. You Must Go. We're looking here at our lovely couple who have been told to go, and in between them, which is rather lovely for me, is Albert Hurwit's mother. Beautiful picture. Beautiful, beautiful. Look at her little hand on her father's knee. Look at the look in her father's eyes. That gets me every time. He knows what's ahead. The mother knows what's ahead. She's staying with the children, waiting to be summoned. Now we know it wasn't for 4 years, but they don't know that yet. And he knows he's going off alone. The third movement of the symphony is the movement that gives the whole symphony its name, Remembrance. And it's a slow movement, and there's an interesting story as to how it came about. The composer had already written, I think it was for 6 stringed instruments, if I remember correctly. It may not have been. And it was about a 2.5-minute piece, something like that. And it was called Adagio for strings. And this is how I got to meet the composer before he came backstage and asked me if we could maybe get the symphony that he felt was inside him out. And I had already encountered him through a absolute 1 in a million chance. He had left a copy of his printed out Adagio for strings, this, a very short piece for very few instruments. And it happened to be sitting on the table of the managing director of the orchestra, of which I was music director. And I went into the office for a meeting, and the managing director was on the telephone. And so while I was hanging around, I just picked up off the table one of many, many scores of music that had been sent in by composers hoping for a performance. And the one I happened to pick up was Albert Hurwit's Adagio for strings. And I liked what I saw. And I remember telephoning him and saying, would he give us the permission for me to include it in a concert? And he said, yes, of course. And I did. And that's how we had first met. So it wasn't a total first meeting when he came backstage to see me after my final concert years later and said, can a symphony be built over my music? And this movement that you hear is what was developed from that little Adagio for 6 stringed instruments into a symphonic slow movement called Remembrance. And what we're going to be looking at as we listen to that are the kinds of places that they are going to yearn for once they're all in America. So we're going to look at village life, villages, school children, etc., as we listen to this beautiful, beautiful, heart-rending music. And it is this movement that won the 2009 American Composers Award. And I think the whole movement, if I had to sum it up, I would call it a last look. Look thy last on all things lovely every hour, as the poet says. And if nothing else, it says, love conquers all. the quite unforgettable slow movement of Albert Hurwit, Symphony No.1, Remembrance, the very movement of the symphony which is entitled Remembrance. The story of the family having been told to go and the Cossacks arriving continues in the last movement with the family's escape. Isaac, Hannah, and the 6 children. But they can't all go together. The last movement has a title. It's called Arrival. And it's really the story of the journey and the arrival in the United States of America. And most of the pictures will speak very much for themselves. What I do have to tell you is that in 1902, Isaac leaves first. And he makes his way eventually to New Britain, but it's quite a journey to get there, as you can imagine. You'll see the ship on which he sailed in 1902, the SS Statendam, and that arrives in New York April the 14th, 1902. And as I say, he's going to work for 4 years to earn the money to bring across the family. And remember that his youngest child, literally, almost the first time he saw her, I mean, she was only a few weeks old, was when she was, 5 years old, 4 years old, whatever, when the rest of the family arrives in New Britain. We shall see the ship's manifest mentioning his name on the SS Statendam, and then we shall take a look again at the Hurwit family that we have already seen, the complete family once they were in America, but before what we're going to get to at the very end of the symphony, which is phenomenal. When I tell you about the rest of the family's journey. But first of all, having set up their arrival, let's listen to part of the journey and then look at the manifest of the 6 children and the mother when they sailed on July the 24th, 1906 in the SS Potsdam. Okay, I'm going to stop it there because I queued up the music for the Potsdam, whereas we're looking at the Statendam. Let me just go to that previous picture. This is what Isaac himself sails on all alone. There's another picture of the Statendam. And here's his manifest. Isaac Milkovich, aged 35. And here's the picture of the family that he leaves behind. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 children and his wife. He is now aboard ship. But as I say, 4 years later, when he's earned enough money and sent them the money to buy the tickets to get there, the 6 and mother all leave together to follow and make this epic journey to the United States. And they make their first leg of the journey in an ox cart, can you believe? I'm not going to stop the music again until the very end, But as I say, you will see their manifest, the children and the wife. You will see their arrival, of course, with the inevitable first distant and then ever closer Statue of Liberty. Ellis Island, the lining up, the waiting, can you imagine? And this is so pertinent at the moment as we turn on the daily news. Refugees trying to get out and travel to a safer place. The music of the klezmer is very much ringing in their heads as they're going to this strange land. You'll see Ellis Island. You'll see pictures of immigrant children lining up, people lining up with luggage. They make their way, once they do get to the shore, they make their way to Grand Central Station, and you'll see yet more lining up at Grand Central Station. Then they have to catch a train to New Britain from Grand Central. A very kind policeman helps them, and eventually they arrive at the bottom of their street where the husband and a new life awaits them, and a new home, of course. And this is where it gets extraordinary, because they climb the hill, and they were supposed to arrive on a specific date. But because of transportation being a little more efficient and less waiting times, etc., they arrive one whole day before they are expected at the house. And one day before they are expected, their dear friend Isaac is standing on a chair at the window, pinning up curtains for their arrival. And through that window, what does he see staggering up the hill with all their luggage? His family, 24 hours early. Tears streaming down his face, he drops the curtains, he races down the stairs, he races out into the streets. They all embrace. No one can speak. The emotions are so high. But what I love is what has gone down in history as his very first words to his wife were, "My dear, how come you can never arrive on time?" A classic, a true classic. And you will see the house in New Britain, in which he had been pinning up curtains, where they're now going to live. And that's going to be followed by a photograph I've shown you already of a house back in Belarus. And the similarity is extraordinary, and I often wonder whether a house on stilts was what they chose when they got to New Britain, because it reminded them of a house style way back home. The rest of the stories absolutely speak for themselves through the photograph. So, going on, the SS Potsdam. The journey is complete, and what you're looking at now is the composer, Albert Hurwit, who went back to Prague to see if he could find the tombstone of Yeshia, he who started it all those years ago. It wasn't to be found, but you can see the state of the cemetery there. It would be hardly surprising if you could find it. But the journey has come full circle, and even more so, this universal experience, which, as I said before, is so pertinent, sadly, to this very day, especially to this very day. The family is here. Let me go back to the picture of them for a moment, because underneath the lampshade on the right is Albert's father with the baby on his lap, and next to the baby you can see Albert's mother. And for the first time in a family photograph we see Albert himself. I would ask you to pick out who is he, but I can give you a clue. Front row, second from the left. White collar, crossed legs. That's our boy. And you've just heard his Symphony No.1, Remembrance. What I love now is what of Albie's descendants, because the family goes very much on. Now an American family, and here by his granddaughter Olivia Hurwit, now married, Mrs. Moreau, has produced this wonderful book, of which I have a copy here, which she wrote when she was 13. And it has been published. It's called The Milk of It. Well, you can see what it's called, by Olivia Hurwit Moreau. And when I thumb through this, there are all sorts of wonderful family memories and stories. This is the point, how stories get passed on. And Olivia's foreword to this book she wrote is as follows. There she is. Here's her foreword. And I do think that one of the photographs in the book really does sum up the fact that the family is now home. Beautiful, beautiful photograph. Thank you very much indeed, everyone, for listening today. And for those of you that are regular listeners, I shall see you next week. Thank you so much. Bye.